Over the past 5 years, we've seen an increasing popularity for modular guns. Modularity gives you options, which in the duty world is a necessity, and Springfield wanted to throw their hat in the game. In this video, I review the Springfield Echelon. I'm going to get right into it with the Springfield Echelon. Now, Springfield just recently released this, and it's their step forward towards being in the modular game. Now, when we talk about modularity in our world, we're talking about that the serialized part is separate from both the grip module, the slide, and the barrel. Now, the idea of that is to give you options on what you may want to do in terms of either grip size, your barrel and slide length, and so much more. Modularity comes in hand when you know you have different people of different hand sizes, shapes, and forms, and how they may like to grip the gun. Now, just kind of going over the Echelon, it's going to start at an MSRP of $679, and the one I have in front of me is in a 4.5 inch barrel, and they have a 5 1/4 threaded barrel option if you so choose. Now, what's neat about this too is that you have grip sizes of different lengths, and so for me with about large XL hands, that's really nice because I can actually get a gun that kind of fits to my liking. Additionally, they actually have on the back strap of this, you can swap those out for different sizes and shapes and forms. You know, one thing that's really nice right off the bat is how they have the optic system mount. Now, what's really distinguishable about this one is that it sits directly on the slide rather than having a plate that does raise it a little bit. Now, the advantage of that is now you don't have such high sights to deal with should you want to co-witness, as well as that you'll have it closer to the bore. The closer you have your red dot system to the bore, the less exaggeration you get in the dot. Now, I would definitely call this a true co-witness because you can look right through to it and you can visibly see the front sight and rear sight along with the dot. Now, most guns you kind of have to work to actually look at that, but this one they've dialed that in pretty well. And additionally, there's about 30 different options you can run with this optic. They actually achieve that by giving you a bunch of different dowels that you can insert so you can put a different optic on that. One thing I do appreciate about this gun is a lot of guns say that they're ambi friendly. This is ambi friendly out of the box because if I was right or left-handed, I could hop on this pistol at any time and use that. Because usually the first thing you got to adjust on most guns that are sort of ambi is that you have to pull out the mag release and you'll have to flip it to the side depending on which hand you use. Now this works on both sides. When you actually start to get into the gun, you'll notice right away that the grip tang of this is it's fairly high in this, giving this a true low bore axis gun experience. So you can really get your grip high into that gun. And additionally, they've got all this extra grip feature that's a good index point if you want to set your support hand there. So when you go to press out, it's a nice natural lock into it. I really can feel that my hand is really high up into the grip tang, and just that index point alone really promotes a strong neutral grip, which I will highlight in the shooting experience of why I really like that. But that's the initial impression when you first grip it. And when you get into most polymer guns, a lot of polymer guns tend to lose their balance with having a lot of weight up in the slide. They did a good job by keeping this weight down into your hands, and I'd say this is one of the better balanced guns out there for a duty pistol, especially in this price range. What is the trigger like? And so there's a little bit of take up there when you get into it, and you get right to the first point to where you start to introduce the creep, and then you just slightly pull it back and it breaks. And you come back out to it, and the reset's kind of long, so you got to get it back out there. It's not as tactile as maybe a Glock per se, but you do hear it. There's a very audible sound to it, and then you just press and go. And it does break at 4.5 pounds, which I would consider ideal for duty. Now I know with Glocks or even the PDP, you can actually reset it and you're right on the wall and ready to fire. This trigger particularly is interesting because you do got to get it out and you got to roll through the creep. That's something I would highlight to the Echelon, but It's not a bad trigger in any way, shape, or form. In this price range, you start to think more utilitarian. And one thing Springfield was cognizant of is making this look good and useful. You know, you've got a full Picatinny reel here, so you can put a large light on this thing if you so choose. And then you've got these serrations that are incredibly useful. And you'll notice there's a fair amount of beveling on both sides of this to where your hand just kind of sits there naturally. And so when you press, even if you were to press check it, you have really solid grip on these serrations. Now, as I work my way through this, the things I think about are reloads and its usefulness for that. Now, this one, it does have beveling on the bottom of it, but as I've kind of worked in dry fire, I did find out that I had to be a little bit more precise with my reloads. Now, when you compare that to the Glock per se, the Glock is a little easier to throw your mags into, whereas this one, you gotta be a little bit more intentful when you're doing that. And when I ran this in a match, I was very cognizant of that. I actually had no issues doing reloads, but for me, I felt like I had to slow down because I had to be very intentional about putting it in. And so with that said, let's talk about the shooting experience. But before I get into that, if you like this video, please hit that like button as that helps me out a lot. And you're gonna wanna subscribe as I'm gonna push out more reviews and more shooting content for you all. Now, I do wanna stop and say thank you to David at the Humble Marksman channel. This review was possible by him lending me this gun. And so definitely check out his review on this because I'm pretty sure it'll probably be better than mine. So I got this gun on a fairly tight time frame, and I didn't have time to go out and shoot it, test it, or do anything before I decided to do a match. And so I just kind of took this gun for what it was, did a little bit of dry fire the night before just so I at least had some familiar with it, but my first experience was shooting a match with it. Now, seeing as how I had not shot this gun prior, it helped that our first stage was a simple warm-up stage in which literally it was 3 to the body, 1 to the head, do a reload, 3 to the body, 1 to the head. I opted to do it a little bit differently and do a tack reload and just run it that way, but I was immediately surprised how soft shooting the gun was for me. I was expecting it to be a little bit more abrasive.
If you are finished, unload show clear.
That's nice.
I did start out shooting this match fairly conservatively, largely because I'm not familiar with the gun. And as I kind of progressed through the match, I started to push it more and more. The challenge I had with it is any shots that required precision at distance, I started to have challenges with in terms of getting in the IDPA down 0 zone. So for me to really get those precision shots, I really had to slow down. The positive in that is how easy it is to get on this gun, hop on it with no experience on it, and get right to work with it. Now, the one thing with this match is I didn't want this to be my review based on me running through a match like you've seen me in other videos. And I really wanted to put this in a setting where I could actually focus and test the gun. Now, I did want to establish a baseline, and so I brought in my Glock 45, which was my budget build if you've seen my other videos. And all it is just a stock Glock 45 with just a Holosun 507C optic on it. So I started this off on a 25-yard drill, just a single target, just to see how both guns performed at distance. I actually preferred the Glock's performance on this as I was able to get a fairly tighter group with it, largely because I was pinning the trigger back and letting it reset at the wall. So it allowed me to get right into a good rhythm and find a consistent spot to land on. The Echelon, I had to work a little bit harder at that, largely because I had to go through the full transition of this trigger, which meant going through the creep as well. I would say that the difference between the two was that with the Glock, I was about 4 to 6 inch group, whereas I was about a 6 to 8 inch group with the Echelon. Now, where the Echelon did shine was when we started to add transitions to this. I started with 3 25-yard targets between both guns, using 2 different ammos, both one being Blazer 115 and Super Vel 147, so a variety to mix it up. I was able to transition from target to target as this gun's balance really made it easy for me to navigate that and not really think about me settling the dot too much. And another thing that's worth highlighting is the tracking I had with this gun. The Glock, I would get a round group, although it might be a little bit tighter because maybe I have a little bit more time on it. Whereas what was interesting was I would get nearly 1 inch wide vertical line on the targets, even in transitions. And I would have to attribute that to the ergonomics of this gun being very ideal of getting my support hand locked in there well. Now, this being a low bore axis gun, it was positive in not having a ton of muzzle rise, but compared to the Glock 45, it was fairly lively. And I'd have to say that as a result of a fairly heavy sprung gun, whereas the Glocks actually have a dual stage spring, making it a much softer impulse. Now, what that translates to is you'll see that the Echelon just has a little bit of oscillation in it. So what that means is that my doubles, when I go and push it at speed, will be tracking higher up and down, and maybe not as ideal of a group. You will see that the dot is much more livelier and bouncing around, whereas the Glock, it does settle a little bit easier. All right, so I want to move into my final segment here. Who is this gun for? If you were to walk into the gun store and take a look at this gun, perhaps against a Glock 17 or a SIG P320, and perhaps even the Walther PDP, this gun is going to be the one that sticks out. It does have the first impressions right. It looks good, it feels good in the hands, and even the trigger pull feels good. And so first impressions, I think this gun's gonna stick out. And if you were gripping all the guns, I would actually probably have to say that I prefer how the SIG P320 feels in the hands. But the second you pull the trigger and then you pull this trigger, the SIG P320 just goes a step down. As for the price range that this gun sits in, the trigger is a step above the P320 for sure. I wouldn't say it's as nice as the PDP, but it's definitely a runner between that. Now, if you were to go shoot all these guns, you'd have to go to the range, you'd have to rent all 4 guns, and at that point, it's gonna be personal preference. I really think the guy that's already had a bunch of Hellcats is gonna be siding with this gun first. Now, as far as the others, it would be a close bet, and for that, I'm actually gonna recommend that you go to the range and do that if you are considering something in this price range, but it will do the job. And so that's what I have for you folks, the Springfield Echelon. I think it's definitely a good step in the right direction for Springfield. I'm confident if you end up buying this gun, you're definitely not gonna be disappointed with its performance or even its reliability. And so with that said, that's what I have for you folks, and until then, we will see you at the range.